Today we are here with Chris Bohland.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, we have a lender, but instead of talking on the buyer side, we're actually going to talk about what a seller can ask a lender when it comes to a buyer who has sent them a contract on their house.
Sure. There are some questions that a seller can ask a lender about a potential buyer. The 6 questions you could ask a lender about a potential buyer are: is the buyer pre-approved or pre-qualified? Has the buyer submitted all the required documentation? Are there contingencies to the loan? Is there a home sale contingency? Are there stipulations on the closing costs? What is the expected time to close on the loan? Is there an appraisal waiver on the property? And are there any special circumstances involved in the loan application, such as a new job, a change in income, or a co-signer on the loan?
So what is the difference between pre-qualified and pre-approved?
Yeah, so there is a difference between a pre-qualification and a pre-approval. Pre-qualification are given out by some banks or lenders where you'll take verbal information over the phone and just kind of issue the buyer an estimate on what they're pre-approved for and an estimate on kind of the numbers and where they're at. Pre-approval is a little bit more in depth. We will actually collect documentation, run the numbers, make sure everything lines up with program guidelines, and issue an actual pre-approval letter. If you have a potential buyer who's pre-qualified, those are mainly just estimates based on what they've given the lender. And if you're pre-approved and you actually have a pre-approval letter, you'll know that buyer is qualified for that loan to purchase your home.
And that's good to know because people can give, oh, this is what I make and this is, the information. And then when you run the actual numbers, there can be differences between that pre-qualification and pre-approval, correct?
Right. A lot of times there's can be a significant difference between estimates and the actual numbers, how they turn out when we give the pre-approval letter.
So it sounds like really important for the seller to know that the documentation has been given and those figures are accurate.
Absolutely. Yep. If you have a pre-approval letter, you can feel confident that the loan has been looked at and it's going to go through.
What are some of the submitted documents that you need to give that pre-approval?
Yeah, so we'll want to make sure that the documents are collected. Typically when we pre-approve a client for a loan, we will collect bank statements, tax returns, pay stubs, W-2s, 1099s, and just any other like income docs or asset documentation that we'll need to verify to make sure that the numbers all line up.
And then you had said some contingencies on the loan. What kind of contingencies should sellers be aware of that a buyer may have?
Right, so you want to manage expectations. Sometimes when a buyer comes to be pre-approved for a loan, there are contingencies such as a home sale contingency. They'll need to sell their home in order to afford the new home. So the main thing is just to manage expectations, make sure the buyer and the seller are on the same page as far as dates and closing date expectations. You want to make sure that everybody's on the same page as far as when the buyer's home is going to sell and when the closing on the new home is going to be. So you'll want to make sure those dates are lined up.
So sometimes buyers can pay for their own closing costs and sometimes they need help from the seller. If a seller sees a contract that has closing costs in the contract, they could call and say, does the buyer need these or does the buyer want these?
Right, you'll want to know when you ask about a potential buyer how their assets look, if they're able to cover the cash to close, or if they would need some assistance from the seller as far as some seller concessions, some seller credits to go towards the closing costs. So yeah, mainly we would want to make sure they have the assets. If they don't have the assets, we're going to make sure that they are able to save or that they're on track to save, meet the closing date requirements to meet that cash to close, or they have a gift from family. Okay.
So another question a seller could ask is, hey lender, when is your expected time to close on this?
Yeah, once we go under contract, we have a pretty good idea of how long it's going to take for the loan to be approved and go through. That depends on when the appraisal is scheduled and a couple other factors such as like title work and stuff like that. But the seller and the buyer are just going to want to make sure that you're on the same page as far as the expected time to close. You'll want to find out when you have it clear to close from the lender. And just make sure everything's in line for the scheduled closing.
And is there a typical expected time to close that sellers should expect, or is there something that would go beyond standard time frame that the seller should know about?
Yeah. In this market, there's no reason that a bank or a lender shouldn't really be able to close within 30 days. Sometimes we can get these closed within 2 to 3 weeks. It just depends on how quick the buyer can get us the documentation needed, let's clear any conditions that the underwriter is asking for. A lot of it depends on commitment from the buyer getting us those documentations and following up in a timely manner.
And that kind of leads to the next question. If there's an appraisal waiver, that could also speed up the timeline because you're not waiting on the appraisal and the reappraisal report, correct?
Right, exactly. On a conventional loan, Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae will sometimes issue an appraisal waiver. Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae will take a look at the numbers on the loan, and if they like how everything looks, the value of the home, the down payment, and they like to see how everything is up, they will issue an appraisal waiver where you don't need to have an appraisal done for the loan. So having an appraisal waiver would save you some time. You don't need to worry about the appraisal coming back. And it also eliminates some risk involved with the appraisal. We always want the appraisal to come back where we need it to be. So without that appraisal, some of that risk is eliminated.
Are there some general guidelines or regulations in order to qualify for an appraisal waiver?
So typically, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae like to see at least 20% down payment to issue an appraisal waiver. If there's a recent appraisal on the property, that'll go into their system and they kind of see how the value matches up compared to the previous appraisal, and if they like what they see, they'll issue an appraisal waiver. One common misconception is that the bank can issue these appraisal waivers, but it's actually Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae that issues these. Freddie Mac can go as low as 10% down and issue an appraisal waiver, but that's pretty rare. Typically we see them around 20% down.
So is it something that a listing agent, when they call you about a potential buyer, could be like, will you ask for an appraisal waiver? Do you think they would qualify? Is that something that we could ask as agents?
Right, before you're making an offer, the agent can definitely call a lender and ask if there's an appraisal waiver. We can run it through our automated underwriting system, and if Freddie Mac or Fannie Mae likes it, then they'll issue the appraisal waiver, and then that could be part of your offer, letting the seller know that there's no appraisal work required for this transaction.
Is that something that you guys can run before under contract?
It is, yes, we can run that before we're under contract and take a look and see if they qualify for that.
So like if buyers really loved a house and are putting in an offer, they would just tell you like, we really love it, this is what we're offering, can you run it? So that when they submit the offer, they could be like, our lender has already checked and we would qualify for
Exactly,
it.
yep,
Okay.
that's how it works, yep.
Is there anything between offer and contract that would change the approval for an appraisal waiver?
Typically, maybe just if the down payment changed.
Okay.
Maybe the purchase price, that could play a factor in there as well. But typically there's a little wiggle room and a little leeway in those numbers. It's usually not an issue, but if the numbers change enough, it can affect the
Like if
appraisal
it
waiver.
goes too high.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And then one last question that sellers could ask is, are there any special circumstances? What can you tell us about how you'd answer that question, or what sellers should be asking?
Yeah, you'll mainly just want to ask the lender if buyer has met guideline requirements. Are there any special circumstances, any changes, any recent changes in jobs, income? Is there a cosigner on the loan? And if any of those circumstances apply, you'll just want to ask the lender if they foresee any issues with any of those changes. As long as they meet guideline requirements, we should be okay.
And would something like a recent job change or a change in income, how might that affect the pre-approval to the final approval?
Right. On a conventional loan, they want to see stability and continuance on income. Want to make sure that Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae typically like to see 2-year continuous employment, but there are special circumstances where we can use 1 year of employment. And if there's a job change or income change or something like that, we can work it to where they qualify for the loan with those special circumstances.
And that could happen to a buyer depending on how long their search takes, you know, when they're pre-approved, and partly why pre-approvals don't last so long, but when they're pre-approved, when they find a house, oh, I started a new job last week, or...
Right, yeah, and pre-approvals, they do expire, so they expire with the credit report. Our credit reports are typically good for about 120 days. We usually tell people we'd like to refresh them about every 90 days, the credit reports, so we have 30 days to close if we need to.